Today, we are particularly delighted to have our very own Dr. Tolulola, who is sharing with us his ongoing research, which is absolutely promising, interesting, and this will be a ground breaker. So let me just briefly introduce Tolu, who is very well known to most people here in the meeting today, especially colleagues who are at SOAS or colleagues who are directly involved in the work with SOAS. Tolu works in the area of accounting in the School of Finance and Management, and he has long experience in this area as an academic and also as a practitioner. Before joining SOAS, he lectured in the Department of Business Administration at Olabisi Onabanjo University in Nigeria. He holds an MBA in Accounting and Finance from Olabisi Onabanjo University and an MSc in the same field from the University of Birmingham. Here there is a great Birmingham connection, I should quickly add. He completed his research in his PhD in management research with particular interest in accounting and finance at the great Imperial College here in London, graduating with the Director's Award for the best thesis. Indeed, Tolu is a complex man. I always like his research because he looks at issues very penetratingly. And what is remarkable about his work is that every new idea he writes about is kind of unique. And the creativity and the uniqueness he imparts in that research makes it actually stand out. Over the last couple of years, he has come to this forum with always a new outlook, a new idea, a new initiative. And today he has actually excelled. His research has covered many areas, including capital market implications of accounting information, corporate finance, corporate governance, as for example, this particular paper, and also corporate narratives. Among his current research projects, Tolu is looking at the determinants and consequences of COVID-19 flash reporting, external reporting in a very flashy way by Japanese firms. And his insight is, of course, informed by his professional background, because he's a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria and an associate member of the Chartered Institute of Bankers of Nigeria. And then he brings this innovation of, for example, currently investigating language and tropes in corporate narratives. And this particular work he's sharing with us today, I can reckon it's going to hit a top audience, a top journal, absolutely promising. And that's why we will all contribute to interrogating the work, looking at alternative arguments. But here is a guy that is telling us, we should be listening basically to what the chairperson is not saying. In other words, we can infer information even when it is not directly stated. And we can be able to read the great minds of the board chairs of UK banks. Tolu, this is again one of your other exceptional ideas, and trying to push us to the limits of what a researcher can achieve by taking new innovations, interrogating issues, and to come up with new information. Let us all put our hands together and welcome Tolu to give us today's seminar. You are most welcome, Tolu. Please speak, as long as you wish. And I would ask colleagues to keep on posting questions and comments in the chat room. And after you have exhausted your presentation, we shall go back and be able to ask you questions, give you some feedback, and have an interactive rest of the session. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. I'm not sure if I could introduce myself better than you did. I'm really very grateful for your gracious words and introduction. Today, I'll be looking at bank chairman's letters, specifically the use of metaphors. And I'll be looking at this from the point of view of a longitudinal study using corpus-based analysis. I will usually start my presentation by visiting some quotations to support the theme of the presentation. In this case, I draw from Aristotle, who tells us that the greatest thing by far is to have the command of metaphor. From a more contemporary writer, Peter Coy, the economics editor of Bloomberg, who tells us that while we are trying to communicate, the best way to communicate is to use metaphor. And he relates metaphor to painting by numbers. And if we have to paint by numbers, then we cannot do but make use of colorful words. Blue, yellow, and green, the primary colors. So metaphor has been with us for a long time, and it's a very important element of language. So what's the roadmap today? I'll start by introducing the topic and the motivation behind this paper. Then I go through the research questions that I've posed. And then the literature review, including the theoretical framework and the use of metaphors in narratives and financial reporting. That will take me to the methodology, and I will be introducing you to the conceptual metaphor analysis, which has 3 ingredients, as we shall come to see. Then I move to the findings of the paper. And I must say at this point that the findings are the early findings. I'm still developing on the analysis of the data. I will conclude this presentation by looking at some of the implications of my research and project some alternative topics for further consideration. How did I start this journey? Actually, the journey started with my interest in big data, analysis of natural language processing. That took me a little bit to text analysis, corporate narratives. In the course of this, I went into Python and machine learning. In the course of, developing my interest in corporate narratives, I actually attended a presentation at this particular forum by Professor Yekini, where she presented a paper on semiotics. I later created some few weeks to study a paper, and in the course of developing myself in this area, I accidentally came across the use of metaphors and the analysis of metaphor in corporate narratives. As I developed my interest in this area, I realized that Lancaster University is actually one of the topmost universities in this area of research. So my journey took me to Lancaster University, 1 week summer school at Lancaster University, where I learned about corporate linguistics, especially in the context of discourse. So that is why today you find me, even from the background of accounting, I'm presenting to you a very interesting topic in linguistics. Needless to say, the UK banking system is an important element of the economy. I would describe it as the heart of the UK economy. In terms of its contribution, it has contributed about 367 billion in revenue between 2005 and 2020, a period covered by this research. In terms of tax, it accounts for not less than 5.5% of the total tax received in 2020. It has also contributed or processed around 75 trillion worth of payments, 40 times greater than the value of the UK GDP. The sector creates high-paying jobs for 7% of the UK workforce. And underlining the importance of UK banks, 2 of the 5 top UK banks are actually constituent members of the global systemically important banks. So we recognize the importance of UK banks. They contribute to the financial stability of the industry and the economy as a whole. However, in the last decades, the sector has been besieged by a number of scandals and crises, starting from the global financial crisis, which happened between 2008 and 2013, which resulted in the UK government, bailing out the banks to the tune of initially 37 billion pounds and eventually about 1.16 trillion. Apart from the negative contribution of UK banks to the global financial crisis, we have also come to realize some of the scandals over time. For example, the Payment Protection Insurance scandal, the PPI, which resulted in banks paying as much as 38 billion in compensation. We are also conversant with the LIBOR and Euribor fixing scandal, as well as money laundering, tax avoidance. In the last 2 years, however, I think we can say to some extent that these banks are trying to rebuild their reputation, given the opportunity, as bad as it is, the COVID-19. So perhaps there is a silver lining, notwithstanding the numerous scandals and crises that the sector has been involved. And we can see the implication of this on a particular bank, for example, HSBC. Over the period between 2006 and 2020, HSBC has been hit with a number of fines by both the UK government and international government, especially the US. So these scandals are actually eating the bottom line. In terms of the industry, we can also see the impact of the scandals, not only on the stock market performance of banks, but the accounting performance of these banks. In fact, since the onset of the global financial crisis, the stock price of these banks have not recovered, even though you can see from this chart that the FTSE 100 has been trending upwards. We can also see the impact of each of these scandals on the financial performance, accounting performance. You can see the spikes, the downward spikes, okay? The PPI, for example, the PPI standard, LIBOR standard, the global financial crisis. So these crises have implication for individual banks as well as the industry as a whole. It also has implication for the economy. As we can see from this graph, there's a downward trend in the contribution of the banking sector to the gross value added. Notwithstanding that the gross value added by the UK economy has been trending upwards, we see that the contribution of banks has been trending downwards. So how do banks counter this negative narrative? I suggest that one of the ways they use is language. From the literature, we recognize that management use their words, their language. It's a resource they use in communicating to investors and stakeholders. In fact, organizations are language systems, and management work with words. Management creates corporate reality through language. And one of the markers, schemes, and tropes that they use is metaphor. Metaphor is very important because it has some ideological as well as persuasive functions that it performs. Business leaders also impose their metaphors on us, according to Lakoff and Johnson, which I'll be referencing a lot in this presentation. So language is very important. It's a tool that management organizations use in order to manipulate stakeholders, public and investors. Perhaps the tool that they use is the letter to shareholder, which is the most widely read section of the annual report. And it is also not audited. Even though banks are highly regulated, letters to shareholders are not audited. Therefore, this provides an opportunity for management to execute their communication strategy. It gives them the opportunity to give us rhetorical words. And it is the function of the public, especially the initiated, to know the underlying meanings of these words. And that is one of the objectives of this study, to try to see why management, chairmen in particular, use particular metaphors rather than other metaphors in order to communicate with shareholders. So language is important, and letter to shareholders seem to be a way in which this language, especially metaphor, is executed. In view of the importance of language and metaphors, I set out to answer 3 research questions. In the context of bank risk environment, I wanted to know whether metaphors in the UK bank chairman's letters to shareholders are related to this environment. That is, whether the use of a particular metaphor, okay, depends on the crisis situation that banks face. I also wanted to know the choice of source domains. We shall come to understand what we mean by source domains in a minute. Whether the choice of source domains depend on the crisis situation of the banking environment. It is not enough for us to identify metaphors. What is, in fact, more important is for us to be able to interpret and explain these metaphors. Therefore, in the third question, research question, I wanted to know the functions of metaphors in UK bank chairmen's letters to shareholders, whether these functions actually change depending on the changing banking environment. The theoretical framework for the study is built around conceptual metaphor theory. And what do we mean by metaphor? Simply, it is the transfer of meaning. The transfer of meaning from a source domain to a target domain. It allows us to understand a particular concept in terms of another concept. As a result of the cross-matching between two concepts. And for those of us who are new to linguistics, I will give some examples in order to put this concept in better perspective. So metaphor helps us to transfer meaning from a concrete domain, which is the source domain, to an abstract domain, which is the target domain. Therefore, it helps in understanding. However, according to the classical theory of metaphor, metaphor is a novel or poetic linguistic expression. That is, it has no relationship to cognitive or thinking or our thoughts. It is within the realm of poets, genius, not ordinary people like you and me. Therefore, from this classical point of view, metaphors are mere words. They are ornaments. They perform no function other than poetic function. The current position, however, is that metaphors actually have cognitive function. They are linked to our thoughts. And this contemporary thinking about metaphor actually came about with the publication of the very, very influential book by Lawal and Johnson, 1980, Metaphors We Live By. According to these authors, metaphors are organs of our perceptions. They govern our everyday functioning. They are the result of our cognitive exercise. And our metaphors are expression or realization of our conceptual metaphors, our thoughts. Therefore, they are not just mere words. Therefore, what chairmen write, what politicians write, their speech, okay, are not just mere words. They have cognitive functions that they perform. For example, when we talk of attack, defend, win, lose, which are words that we come across in business write-ups. The contemporary concept of metaphor suggests that we are actually projecting a conceptual metaphor, which is business is a war, or business is a game, or a sport. Or when accountants make use of snapshots, the balance sheet is a snapshot of, it is ideological, and that is the way accountants have influenced the discourse. Then we start asking ourselves some questions. If it is a snapshot, that means that it is a true and fair representation of the financial situation. But we forget to ask another question: who is in charge of this snapshot? Those who are in charge of the snapshot have a role to play in how the shot is taken. So metaphors have ideological tone. They have persuasive elements to them. They also affect the way we deal with things. For example, cancer. When we say you will beat this, you are a fighter, we are suggesting that cancer treatment is a battle. Therefore, whoever loses the battle is a failure. And as a result of this, in fact, NHS has advised that such metaphors should not be used in therapy. Because we now appreciate the fact that the words, the metaphors that we use have implications. They affect our actions. They affect our thoughts. In fact, they are the result of our thoughts. Therefore, by understanding the metaphors of chairmen, we can understand their thought, their thinking, and therefore their actions. As I said, metaphor performs a lot of functions, and I summarize some of these functions in line with the literature. They have persuasive function, and many can grade, for example, looked at the letters, the CEO letters the CEO letters to shareholders, and discovered that they are laden with metaphors aimed to persuade the audience. They are sense-making. They help us understand an abstract concept in the context of a concrete concept. And because of their nature, they also give sense, in which case they determine our understanding. And that is the way in which metaphors are used to manipulate the audience. They are strategic ambiguity because they have different explanations. By their nature, they carry different explanations. So when leaders use metaphors, they leave us to interpret the metaphors according to our own frame. Therefore, they contribute to edging. Metaphors affect our action, and I think I made this point some few minutes ago. For example, you talk of war on terror, which was a very popular metaphor that the former US government used in their pursuit of bin Laden. Even though it was a metaphor, it was realized practically in the invasion of Iraq. So when we use metaphors, our metaphors are determined by our thoughts. And these metaphors may also lead to our action, consistent with the Savvy-Whorf hypothesis. The language we speak predisposes us to think and act in certain ways. So our language not only determines our thoughts, they are the result of our thoughts, and they may determine our action. So how do metaphors work? How are they manipulative? How do they help us to understand a particular abstract in the context of a concrete abstract? Metaphors work by metaphoric entailment. And what we mean by metaphoric entailment, highlighting a particular aspect while hiding some other aspect, while silencing some other aspect. So when I make use of a particular metaphor, I am projecting a particular positive aspect of that metaphor and silencing or backgrounding some other aspects of that metaphor. Metaphors are one-directional. What we mean by this is that the source domain can only map the target domain, and the target domain cannot map the source domain. For example, economy is war, but war is not economy. So it works through metaphoric entailment, highlighting, and silencing. It also includes the concept of invariance principle. That is, the structure of the target domain remains the same. It's not changed as a result of the transfer of meaning from the source domain to the target domain. So when we talk about the economy, we can use some of this entailment. I'm sure many of us are exposed to the very popular advert by KLM in the 90s, using SWAN. When you see something like this, okay, which is a metaphoric expression of the quality of KLM, the company was trying to project elegance, big size, stability, reliability, highlighting the positive features of a SWAN and matching those features with particular features of KLM. But what if we have this? Sorry. What we have this? The features that have been hidden, the particular features that have been hidden about SWAN is now being highlighted. And that feature is the fact that SWANs are also very aggressive. So it is our function as researchers to understand the words of management, the words of business leaders, to bring out the alternative truth, the alternative interpretation of these words, and to see if they have persuasive meanings or ideological meanings. And that is what I try to do in this study. Metaphors are very pervasive in financial reporting, especially given that most of these journalists are trained in arts. So they are very good in metaphor. And the first early study of metaphors in financial reporting was actually by Charteris Black, 2004. And it discovered the use of physical conflicts, mental health, physical health, nuclear disaster, and behavior of gas in financial reporting. So when we talk of volatility, the market is volatile. We are using the behavior of a gas, okay, to explain the performance or the behavior of the market. When we say the market is down or up, we are using movement metaphor, spatial metaphor, to explain the behavior of the market. Nuclear disaster suggests that this is natural, okay? Therefore, may require less intervention from government. Metaphors perform pragmatic and ideological functions in stock markets. For example, some studies have looked at the stock market crisis and the currency market tumor. And they see that the way the crises are reported, okay, depends on your ideological bent. For example, if you are a conservative, you are likely to make use of free market economy, suggesting that the market should be allowed to operate without intervention, compared to the leftists who are usually in favor of more regulation. So we find that metaphors in financial reporting, okay, suggest our hidden ideological bent. And they also depend on our culture. For example, a study by Chatterley's Black and Ellis finds that the culture, our culture the metaphor that we use depend on our culture. Spanish, for example, will favor psychological states, metaphors relating to psychological states, while the English will prefer the use of sailing metaphors as a result of their association with religion and sailing as a sport. Perhaps because of the pervasiveness of metaphors in financial reporting, business leaders are also using metaphors in their communication with their stakeholders, the shareholders, especially in period of crisis. So metaphor is a tool for communicating during crisis. For example, we look at the study by Greg and Amenik 2004, looking at the letter to shareholders issued by Enron just before the dawn of the financial crisis. And in particular, the speech or the hearing by the US Congress in respect of this crisis and the case of Joseph Baridino, the then CEO of Adelson. In that particular study, the authors find that the hearing was laden with the use of sports, war, religion, as well as journey metaphors, all of which were meant to avoid responsibility for the crisis. Again, there is another study by Amenik and Greg in 2017 relating to the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. In that particular study, the then CEO of BP used art metaphor, which related, okay, to our emotion, trying to appeal to us emotionally, as well as focus metaphor, trying to shift our attention by the use of these two metaphors. We all are very conversant with the phone hacking scandal of News World, as a result of which there was a hearing by the UK House of Commons. Again, a paper by Amenik and Greg, the two authors who have contributed a lot to this area of research, reviewed the hearing of Rupert Murdoch in the US House of Commons and discovered the use of metaphors. The company is on a journey. Business is a war. So if business is a war, then we can easily predict the type of actions employees of News World are likely to undertake. Because in war, possibly there are no rules. Everything is taken in war. But we know that this is not true. They use the business is war metaphor to justify the action of its employees, while also introducing the journey metaphor. The company is on a journey. The destination of this journey, nobody knows. But by using the journey metaphor, it projects the possibility that there's progress being made. So we know that CEOs and chairmen also use metaphors in their communications to stakeholders. In particular, we also see the use of metaphor during the global financial crisis. Okay, this paper by Turish and Agi 2012 analyzed the testimony by 4 banking CEOs at the UK House of Commons in order to understand the actors, the social actors in that particular crisis. The CEO drew on a number of metaphors, natural forces, natural disasters. So if they are natural disasters, then they are rare. Therefore, nobody is responsible for it. Bankers are also victims of this natural disaster. Therefore, they should not be blamed for the crisis. But we know that they were trying to shift the responsibility. And that is the role of metaphors, okay? By hiding a particular aspect, silencing some other aspects, leaders use their metaphors to influence the discourse. Their counterparts in the US also made use of similar metaphors. Economic problems and natural disasters. So if they are natural disasters, they try to blur agency. Who is responsible for the global financial crisis? No one. And perhaps they won the debate because as we talk, none of the principal participants in the financial crisis has actually been tried. So they use their metaphors, their words, to blur responsibility, to blur agencies, and to reduce the possibility of harsh regulations. If they are natural disasters, okay, perhaps there is little or nothing we can do about it. Bankers are also survivors of these natural disasters, and therefore they need our public empathy in the form of bailouts. So banks also make use of metaphors, along with their counterparts in the financial reporting worlds. Our duty is to know and understand the meaning of these metaphors. To summarize, metaphors are pervasive in letters to shareholders. They are used in period of good performance, as we see in the case of Amenik et al. 2007. In periods of bad performance, Amenik and Greg 2000 and Bujagi and Makonomi 2012. They are used to legitimize crisis, illegitimacy crisis. Billis and McDavis 2012, for example. In fact, they are also used in normal times, as we see in the paper by Michael Davis and Okola 2012. So because of the power of metaphor, which we can differentiate from simile or analogies, leaders rely on metaphors in order to influence our thought. So to summarize, the conceptual metaphor theory suggests that metaphors are all pervasive. In fact, there are studies that point to the fact that we make use of metaphors in every 3 sentences that we make. Metaphors are systematic mappings between 2 conceptual domains, the source domain and the target domain, one of which is concrete and the other is abstract. Metaphors have ideological, pragmatic, and rhetorical functions. However, there are scant studies on the UK chairman's use of metaphors, in particular, UK bank chairman's use of metaphor. Even though, as I said, this letter to shareholder is one of the widely read section of the annual report. However, there's a study in 2021 that looks at letters to shareholders, UK bank chairman's letter to shareholders. This study is a lot different from what I'm looking at, because it looks at legitimization strategies different from metaphors, even though it looks a little bit at metaphor. It is a lot significantly different from what I present in this seminar. There is also a lack of diachronic studies on metaphor use. What do I mean by that? The comparison between periods. In this study, I want to compare period before the crisis, during the crisis, as well as post-crisis. And I consider the COVID-19 as the post-crisis period, even though we know that the banks have not really recovered from the crisis starting from 2008. So how do I want to execute the research? I borrow from the critical metaphor analysis, which incorporates 3 elements. I've already discussed one of the elements, which is conceptual metaphor theory. That I'll be using to answer the research questions 1 and 2. I'm also building on the corpus linguistics, which also helps in answering questions 1 and 2. I'm currently working on the third research question, which borrows from discourse analysis, trying to understand the meaning of the metaphors that I've established in this paper. So the methodology is built around three areas of study: conceptual metaphor theory, corpus linguistic, and critical or discourse analysis. The methodology is broken into 2 phases. In phase 1, the idea is to be able to identify the metaphors and allocate the metaphors to source domains. In the second phase of the study, I wanted to answer the research questions using quantitative analysis as well as qualitative analysis. So I built a corpus of 87 letters to shareholders made up of 5 UK banks for the period 2002 to 2020. This corpus consists of about 136,000 tokens. That is words. The corpus of letters to shareholders were then taken to Langbus, a concordancy tool. That tool was actually developed by Lancaster University. I used the concordancy tool to part of speech tag the words, POS tagging. That is, I wanted to know the part of speech that each word belongs in. Because studies suggest that metaphors are most likely to occur in verbs, nouns, adverbs, and adjectives, I only concordance this part of speech: verbs, nouns, adverbs, and adjectives. I recognize the fact that I've been a little bit biased here, because prepositions are usually used in container metaphors. So the result I'll be presenting here will not include container metaphors, because I did not include this part of speech in the concordancy. Once I've concluded this part of speech in Langboss, I transferred the lines to Excel. In Excel, I further excluded proper nouns like names of people, names of city, countries, because these are not likely to be used metaphorically. I also excluded the lexicalized words or verbs. For example, make, take, because these have little or no semantic content. I then move to the identification of metaphors using Prakuja's group methodology. And I'm going to present an example of this methodology soon. Then I allocated the metaphors to source domain. I will give some examples before moving to phase 2. Here I have the advantages of using metaphors. It allows us to be of using corpus-based analysis. It allows us to be able to identify enough metaphors as possible. We can see the return patterns of lexical and collocations in the corpus, and I will show you some examples of this in the next slides. So how does the Prakuja's method work? For each lexical unit, by which I mean each word in the corpus, for each word in the corpus, I ask a number of questions, okay, following this method. The conceptual meaning contrasts with the basic meaning, but can be understood in comparison with it. So I have to identify the conceptual meaning of each word, as well as the basic meaning of that word. And I have to compare whether there is a tension between the contextual meaning and the basic meaning. The basic meaning is one that is more concrete, related to our body action, more precise, and possibly more historical, older than other use of that word. It is not necessarily the most frequent word. And this method suggests that we should use our dictionary, the recommended 2 dictionaries that we should use in order to establish these contextual and basic meanings. So if there is a tension between the conceptual meaning and the basic meaning of a particular word, but we can understand that word in the context of its basic meaning, okay, we are going to identify the word as a metaphor. So what we do here is the identification of metaphor linguistic expression, which is not the same as conceptual metaphor that we adopt, we are going to identify in stage 2. I gave a case study of foundation, and I draw from the letter to shareholder by Barclays PLC in 2013. Barclays is going through a major transition. Critical progress was made in 2013 in putting in place the foundations. So in this particular concordance line, my interest is on the word foundation. Is foundation used in its basic meaning or in its contextual meaning? And is the contextual meaning different from the basic meaning? The method suggests that we use Macmillan English Dictionary, which I was able to access online. And the contextual meaning of foundation, the most basic parts of something, which the rest of it develops. And the basic meaning, the part of a structure of a building that is below the ground and support the rest. Obviously, from these two meanings, we can see that the basic meaning is different from the contextual meaning in that particular extract of letters to shareholders. Therefore, I mark foundation as a metaphor in the corpus. And I do that for each word in the corpus. We can see a sample concordance lines for the word, the lexical units foundation. So this is the node that I'm interested in. This is the node that I'm interested in. So for each extract relating to foundation, I consider whether foundation is used metaphorically or otherwise. And as we can see from here, okay, foundation is usually used in its contextual form, in its metaphoric form. Okay, in this case, I did not mark foundation as a metaphor. The advantage of using corpus is that I can also see what these metaphors are evaluating. And as we can see, as a result of the crisis, banks are using ethical words, rebuilding trust, values and standard, transformation. So I can see what each metaphor is moderating, evaluating as a result of the use of corpus-based analysis. So this is what I did for each word in the corpus in order to identify whether the word is metaphorically used or otherwise. Perhaps a question that one may need to answer is that this is the way we all talk, okay? This is the way we talk. It is not metaphoric because we are used to using foundation. And because of that, we need to visit the concept of conventional metaphor. So when we talk of metaphor, metaphors have a life. They have a life of their own. They start from being novel to being conventional to being dead. Novel metaphors are within the realm of poets, but conventional metaphors are used regularly by ordinary people like you and me. But it doesn't mean that they are not metaphoric in nature. They support our evaluation of entities, our evaluation of events, our evaluation of actors. And leaders also use these metaphors because they are simpler than novel metaphors. Because metaphors are like puzzles. The more difficult they are, the more difficult we are able to appreciate them, the less likely that they will be persuasive. Because if they are difficult, we are going to be using more of our brain resources to discover the meaning of these metaphors. So in fact, leaders actually make use of conventional metaphors instead of novel metaphors, and dead metaphors are perhaps not used. So even though this is the way we all speak, we have control over the words, our choice of words. So conventional metaphors actually play a role in persuading or projecting our ideological bents. Having identified a metaphoric expression, for example, foundation, I need to determine which semantic bent this particular metaphor belongs. For example, is it journey metaphor? Is it building metaphor? Is it war? In this case, the last case that I presented, foundation, I discovered that this belongs in building metaphor. And how do we do this? Okay, it is suggested that we make use of dictionaries of metaphors. Therefore, I make use of master metaphor list, Collins co-build English metaphor, which is hosted by University of Birmingham, Bank of English. I also made use of metaphor box by Macmillan English Dictionary. So for each word that I have identified as a metaphor, I wanted to know which semantic field they belong in. Recently, with my interaction with Lancaster University, I discovered that you can also use this software to analyze the semantic field, but I did not use it at this stage. So the idea is to now categorize the metaphors into their source domains, their semantic fields. Another point. Recognizing the fact that I am not a native speaker, neither do I have a degree in linguistics or lexicography, I needed someone to double check my classification of metaphors and the identification of metaphors in particular. So currently, a third year PhD student in linguistics is looking at a random sample of the metaphor that I've identified in order to see whether those metaphors can actually be classified as metaphors in line with the rules, the practice rule, as well as the dictionaries that we have been suggested, that has been suggested that we use. So this is the structure of the corpus. One particular point I wanted to make here is that we can see that over time, the number of words have increased. And this increase, the increase in number of words, actually tallies with the crisis period, suggesting that during crisis, management make use of more words because they have to explain the nature of this crisis. So the number of words have been increasing over time, and they are significantly higher during crisis than before the crisis period. As I said, I group the metaphors into source domains. I'm showing this page is actually about three to 4 pages, but I'm showing an extract of some of the journey metaphors that I identified, war metaphors, as well as vision metaphors. So we see, for example, in the case of journey metaphors, the use of lexes such as journey, milestone, navigate, path, drive, depart, destination, bumpy. And these metaphors were used at different stages of the study, pre-crisis, crisis, and COVID-19. So we see examples of the use of metaphors during this period. In this particular slide, I wanted to see the productivity of the use of metaphors. Which metaphors are more prevalent in a particular period relative to another period. So these are the source domains that I have identified in the corpus. The use of living organism, building, world journey, vision, blah, blah, blah. So I wanted to say the resonance. We measure productivity of metaphor using the resonance, okay? And this is the type. For example, word. If I pick drive, for example, drive is the type, but I can have different inflection of drive. Driving, drove. So I count the number of tokens for each source domain, and for each type, I count the number of tokens. The product between the products of the number of tokens and type divided by the total will give me the productivity of each particular source domain in the corpus. So which source domains are used more likely or most likely in a particular period relative to other domains? For example, pre-crisis, we see the use of living organism. During crisis, we see building, and that starts suggesting to us why are chairmen using building metaphor during crisis period? Because they have to start afresh. They have to lay solid foundation for the future. They have to build their reputation, build their trust. And we see examples of this in the corpus. That building actually relates to words such as trust, okay, and reputation. During the COVID-19, we see that journey metaphor was actually used more than other source domains. So the question then is, why do they use a particular metaphor relative to other metaphors in a particular crisis situation? But before I answer that question, okay, I present here the top 5 metaphors used during the period. So we are building metaphor, journey, living organism, war, and vision during the period. But we see variation in the use of metaphor. Variations in the use of metaphor. And it is this variation that I want to explain quantitatively. So for my first research question, I wanted to ask whether there's an association between the use of metaphor and bank crisis environment. Now, I am not distinguishing between the source domain used. I wanted to know whether banks use more metaphor during bank crisis relative to a period of stability. So I created a 2x2 contingency table to test this hypothesis. And we can see from the chi-square, that we reject the null hypothesis of no association between metaphor use and bank crisis environment. That is, the use of metaphor actually depends on the crisis environment. However, the Kramer's V statistic shows that the effect is small. This effect is small. So even though I see a significant relationship between the use of metaphor and bank crisis environment, I also discovered that this effect is small. I extended the analysis to cover research question 2, whether the source of metaphor in use depends on the bank crisis environment. Because this table is very long, I decided to collapse the table and show you the most important elements of the table. Also, I collapsed a number of metaphors because the expected values of these metaphors were less than 5. And going by the assumption of chi-square, I will have evaluated this basic assumption by using such metaphors in the calculation or the computation of the chi-square value. So I collapsed those metaphors that are not productive into a group which I named order. As we see in this table, we also notice, okay, reach the conclusion that the source of metaphor, the source domain of metaphor in use relates to the bank crisis environment. So there's a significant relationship between the source domain in use and the bank crisis environment. Again, if we look at the Kramer's V statistic, which is 0.037, we find that the size effect is also small. So even though I find support for my second research question, second hypothesis, the effect is small. But the story is not complete. I wanted to say which particular metaphors actually explain the relationship that I have uncovered. So what I did was to do a post hoc test. I did a post hoc test to actually evaluate which of these metaphors are significant in explaining the omnibus relationship that we have discovered. The reported adjusted standard residuals are the Z value. The rule of the thumb is for us to accept the Z value or the adjusted standard residual if it is at least equal to 1.96. That is, the absolute value is equal to 1.96. However, because I also ran multiple analysis, I corrected for the possibility of making a type 1 error using Bonferroni corrected alpha. So the Bonferroni corrected alpha is 0.01. I calculated the p-value for each of the analysis. For example, in this case, the p-value is 0.01, and I reached the conclusion that building metaphor was significant in the pre-crisis period as well as the crisis period, but not during COVID-19. So even though there is a significant relationship between the use of metaphor or source domain and banking crisis, a few source domain actually explain this relationship. And these source domains are the living organism, building journey, as well as physical earth. So metaphors are important, okay? But not all metaphors are important. I reached the conclusion that the prevalent metaphors used during this period are the identified metaphors: building, living organism, and physical earth. One particular surprise to me in the analysis was that I did not discover enough number of natural metaphor or nature metaphor which were used by CEOs in avoiding responsibility during the financial crisis. These metaphors did not show up in the metaphors used by chairmen. As we can see from this table, we do not have nature or natural forces metaphors. In terms of the third research question, this is where I'm still developing the argument, trying to understand, interpret, and explain the use of these metaphors. But currently, as you can see from the concordancy line that I presented some few moments ago, we see evidence of the use of metaphor in rhetorical sense, in pragmatic sense, perhaps not ideological, but they perform, as far as I've discovered in this early analysis, they perform some rhetorical functions. For example, I go back to this table. When a chairman says we make relentless focus, or they have relentless focus on what? Relentless. And that takes me back to the one of the letters, okay, to shareholders written by the chairman of Enron just before the collapse of that company. Laser-based focus, okay? And that particular phrase has been used to attack letters to shareholders a lot. Relentless effort. How do we measure relentless effort? This suggests to me that focus is not used, it's used not only metaphorically, but also used to manipulate the readers. It is used in a rhetorical way to manipulate the leaders. And we see various examples from the corpus. And the idea is to bring together all these examples in order to explain and therefore answer research question 3, explain the use of metaphors in letters to shareholders. So in summary, I conclude that bank crisis seems to impact how much is said. Chairmen use more words during crisis because they have to explain the crisis to stakeholders. They also use metaphors, perhaps in a rhetorical way, in order to hide responsibility, in order to influence or persuade the readers. However, the effect is more, as we see in the analysis that I've just presented. The choice of metaphors they use also depends on the bank crisis situation. We see the use of building, journey, as well as living organism metaphors at different stages of the banking crisis. So I conclude by saying that the corpus that I've analyzed invokes a number of metaphors, consistent with the idea that metaphors are used for impression management, in line with the study by Bozo and Kumar 2007. In addition, the voluntary disclosures in letters to shareholders offer us clues to corporation's future plan. So in particular, the use of building, okay, throughout the course of the corpus suggests to us that the banking sector is in the process of rebuilding its reputation, laying the foundation for a new era in banking. However, we also see the mixture of journey metaphor in this discourse. So the question is, where is the destination of this journey? What is the destination of the journey? We know they want to rebuild their reputation by using building metaphor, but we are not sure where the journey will take them because of the use of journey metaphors. In terms of future studies, this particular paper concentrated only on the UK banking sector. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, it is possible that our culture actually suggests the type of metaphors that we use. Perhaps a contrastive diachronic study in respect of the use of metaphors between or among different countries will help us to understand the research questions that I've raised in this study better. Also, I've used a corpus that consists only of male chairperson. We know that the gender also affects, our gender also affects our use of words. Perhaps we can extend this corpus to also consider CEO letters to shareholders and see whether the use of metaphors depend on gender across different bank crisis situation. Yeah, that is it. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to hear your feedback and answer some of the questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Tolu, for presenting extremely interesting work and going through all the major components, including motivating the work, sharing with us knowledge about the literature. For me, it was all learning everything new. The literature which you uncovered so well, and then the methodologies in vogue in researching these ideas, and then the methodology you finally adopted, the statistical analysis that was using the chi-square rule to be able to make rejection or acceptance depends on the threshold value, and the conclusions you have uncovered. Excellent work, absolutely exciting. And yeah, so you also mentioned in terms of further studies how you intend to, for example, the idea that you could focus on a female chairpersons rather than male, or male chairpersons. You focus on the field, depends on that. And then, of course, it may also be the case that one of the things I posted in the chat that suppose the focus was on specific board chairs communicating, for example, about increase in profitability, announcement of profitability, profits earned for the year, or announcement of the dividend earnings, or 2 times in a year if the dividends are paid twice. But maybe that then would, of course, constrain the sample. The sample would be relatively smaller than going around a number of things. So, okay. So let me see whether, please, if you have a question, please put up your hand using the reaction button, which has got various options that can allow you to put up your hand, and I'll see it and call upon you to ask your question. There are also some very good comments posted in the chat. Let me go through. There was an observation by Kemi. She found the presentation absolutely impressive, and is asking to look at the paper when it's available. I think there is a question from from Juliet. So, Juliet, if you are still around, maybe your comment in the chat, if you could say a little bit about it so that it can be internalized into what Tori is trying to get the feedback on. Juliet, yes. Are you free to go ahead?
I'm here, yes. Thank you, Professor. Yep, thank you, Dr. Tolu. I thought it was very interesting, fascinating, actually. When I saw it come up as today's session, I'm like, I must be here, because I think it's very, very interesting what you're doing. But I made a comment. My comment was just maybe, well, 2 things. Firstly, the metaphors in general. I found when you were talking about them, it seemed very like it's a negative thing, actually. So I was wondering whether, without metaphors anyway, does it make it very difficult for these CEOs, whoever, within these letters, does it make it difficult if they don't use it? So perhaps they're just trying to explain a very complex area, perhaps an economic situation. If the use of metaphors is actually just trying to make it accessible to a wider population of people so that we understand it. That was one comment. And then listening even further, the model and further studies, I wonder actually, rather, because the study seems to always look backwards, it looks at past events. I was actually wondering, actually, could the study, even in a better light, look at it to predict actually bad behavior? For example, in market abuse, I think if we could use metaphors to predict behavior that potentially of what these, when they're communicating, traders communicating with each other, actually, that would be a fantastic model, I think. But overall, I thought it was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Juliet, for those suggestions, and especially relating it to a behavior, which could be changes in behavior or consistency of behavior. Yeah. Tolu, respond to comment.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. I thought that particular comment is interesting. In fact, there are some studies already using machine learning, okay, to identify metaphors, and as a result, to be able to predict action. So it's a line of study that I've already identified, okay. Quantitative, in this particular study, I'm making use of basic chi-square, okay. It's also possible for us to incorporate regression analysis, okay, and machine learning to be able to predict future action as a result of the metaphor in use. And I made mention of that at the beginning, that our actions, our metaphors can actually predict our action. Okay, so we can use metaphors to predict future actions by regression and some other quantitative frameworks.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Any comments? There is a raised hand from Jeffrey. Jeffrey, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tolu, for this work. I really enjoyed the presentation and the topic as well, because it's an area very close to what I've done before. I just wanted to ask whether you have considered changes in the role of auditors. I mean, looking at the regulatory environment, specifically their reporting structure. For example, the auditors across Europe, including the UK, have been mandated to report to regulators, unlike before, where they report to just the shareholder. So, and studies have shown that such mandates have changed the tone of CEOs' report and presentation. So, I was wondering whether you consider such changes in auditors' reporting environment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. No, I did not look at that particular aspect. As you can see, the methodology was tailored towards the research question. Okay, I did not. If I was to look at that, then I have to look at regression analysis, and the purpose, the focus of this paper, it does not tend towards that line. I wanted to use, ultimately, what I wanted to do is to use discourse analysis to explain the use of metaphors, okay? And the use of regression is somehow inconsistent with discourse analysis at this stage.
Tolu, but I'm a little bit sympathetic actually with possibly what Jeffrey is saying, and maybe I can understand where you're acting from, try to have a consistent methodology. But you did mention you want to explore mixed methods, and I would guess that regression would bring a little bit more of a scientific type of investigation. Suppose you were to extend the argument and argue that the use of metaphors allows the chairperson of the board to actually sometimes get away with murder. Let me use another metaphor, to get away with murder. In other words, they can anticipate when the company is not performing well, and then use some metaphors to actually hide the fact that the company is in a crisis. They can also use the metaphors to amplify or exaggerate, add a little bit more spice on the performance of the company. So if use of metaphor by the chairman is deliberate, it has an objective, I mean, they have an objective why they decide to use their metaphor, right? This is where the argument would start. And also something about the behavior of the as Juliet was saying. But let's pursue this idea that the chairperson is using a metaphor to be able either to hide bad performance or to amplify medium performance and project it to investors and the board members and as something very unusual. Okay, so we could interpret the measures you have been getting on those metaphors with respect to a clear, quantifiable objective or dependent variable or endogenous variable as firm performance, which is measurable. I know it's measurable in many ways. Okay, it could be the book, it could be the share price, could be the return on equity, return on assets, could be any of those, acceptable measures. But what you are trying to say is, look, actually, those chairs, if it is significant, you have a hypothesis to say, actually, chairs communication or use of metaphor does not in any way, compromise, or it does compromise, depending on positive and negative coefficients, the performance of the company. Would that be adding a quality, or because what you have is that the numbers you have got from the metaphors, those are qualitative, but the use of the endogenous variable, a measure of performance, or even dividends, right, is quantitative, and that's your mixed method.
Yeah.
So the question is therefore whether you are using value by taking excursion into or extending the excursion into a regression analysis, or whether you are losing value in terms of the quality of the paper, or you are adding value.
I am not underplaying the importance of Jeffrey's suggestion.
Yeah.
Okay. In fact, I already noted the fact that you can use, even though it's a new area of study, you can use a metaphor as your independent variable to, for example, explain performance.
Yeah,
okay?
Yeah.
And vice versa. But what I'm saying is that is not the direction of this particular paper. But it doesn't mean that it is mutually exclusive. Okay, it could be an extension of the paper, but as presently constituted, it is not the direction of the paper.
Yeah, I think I understand your point as well, to do like you just said, even if it's in the form of extension, because even in your concluding part, you said that this result may be affected by the culture or the environment of the UK. So I think that has a link with the regulatory environment per se, and also when you look at the shock, let me put it that way, like what I just said. I know 2016 is in between this period you study. For example, the introduction of that mandatory auditor's report in an extension of this, that may be considered as in a simple regression, like leaning towards Victor's suggestion, that can be considered as a shock in a simple, I don't know, indifference method, or even a simple logistic analysis to kind of capture the effect of that shock. Or you can actually compare the use of metaphor before that introduction and after the use of metaphor after that introduction, if there may be difference between these two periods.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yes, logistic regressions would also be, would help you have a binary dependent variable. You are just dividing the firms, those who use this, those who don't, those who where the chairs don't push the limit on the use, and those who do. So you also
that may need me introducing another research question to the paper. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Because yes, those methods would involve a different an additional angle. I think the question as researchers is whether that additional angle will generate results that make companies completely excited in the use or non-use of the metaphor, which is the impact part of the, the what is the uptake and how does it lead uptake, and also whether in terms of the quality of the paper, the journal is likely to, the paper is likely to enter into a better journal because of that kind of element. Those are some of the questions, some of the issues that will be keeping you slightly awake as you work on the paper. Yeah. I saw somebody. I saw a hand, and then it disappeared. Athena, did you see a hand coming up and going back?
I think it was Jeffrey's.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Yeah. Okay, so I guess given the huge interest, this is a paper that we look forward to when it is available, and you've been able to do some write-up. Maybe you could share for further input and for further dissemination. But it is absolutely interesting, and this is a characteristic of Tulu's always innovative, Tulu's innovative research, where he peers into something completely phenomenal, and we think that this is absolutely highlighting an issue innovatively. You acknowledge where people have tried to do work in this area, but you also put across the idea of what exactly you are adding to it, and that's absolutely helpful. Good. So I don't know whether you, Toro, I give you a chance to say something for the
class. I just wanted to say thank you, Victor, for providing the platform to present my research and my thoughts, and perhaps more importantly to the audience for their attendance and contribution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you indeed. And there were people who had, expressed a lot of interest in this paper. I think when it's available, we can do a further dissemination, and maybe at that time we can also get some discussants, maybe practitioners, and they tell us why, their own insight into this use. For sure, I am 100% convinced that these chairs actually use the metaphors kind of deliberately. They know what they are doing. Okay, but until now, Tulu has just kind of given me a lens, and you did awake my interest to say, actually, this communication is deliberate, and we need to understand it. So I think there should be a further conversation on this. If the paper comes back, we'll possibly get also practitioners sitting in and give us their interpretation of the paper when they have had a chance to read it. But thank you so much. And let me thank all of you for being able to make it. We know there were a number of parallel activities across the campus in SOAS. And maybe, but you are able to put that behind you and join us for this meeting, which is very much appreciated. Thank you, and we see you here next week. Thank you.
Thank you.